Okay, welcome to a special edition. This is the first of several requests I have for different movies to review. And this one's special because this was a birthday request. So, Miss Ramirez, happy birthday. And if you've clicked on this video and you're watching, this is, of course, about Madam Web. Let us discuss. Okay, this movie. So many things to say. This movie, if you don't know, came out earlier this year, and I sat on it. I was intentionally sitting on whether or not I would watch this movie because I just wasn't sure based on the marketing. I don't think the marketing was very good, and that had an effect on my excitement level on this movie. Now, if you know me at all, some of you do, you know Spider-Man is one of my favorite characters. Probably my number one Marvel character since I was a kid. So any Spider-Man property is always immediately going to be interesting. The issue with these movies, or at least the Sony released movies, some of them, is that they are coming out with these characters who are centering their own movie without Spider-Man. So, okay, on its own, it's an affront to Spider-Man fans. Like, why is Spider-Man not in this movie? But when you look at it on a case-by-case basis, each of these characters provide something that's fascinating, and there's things about them that's worth exploring. The trouble is that the pattern I'm seeing with some of the Sony releases outside of the Spider-Verse movies and any solo Spider-Man effort is that they're not well received all the way. Even the Venom movies, as sort of decent as they are, they're probably the strongest Sony produced Spider-Man properties. But even them, they're not particularly highly rated when you when you compare them against the Spider-Man movies. So there's a pattern I'm noticing with Sony putting out Spider-Man themed movies and how they're not as good as a lot of people, some people might want. In the case of Madam Web, particularly, it almost feels like, now again, I don't know behind the scenes what happened with this movie. It feels like this was kind of a setup for director S.J. Clarkson to fail, which is unfortunate. And this is me making an assessment that I don't know if it's true or not. It just that's what it feels like to me. So let's get into what this movie is about. If you don't know who Madam Web is, she's a fairly important character in the Marvel universe. In the comic books, she is an elderly woman who is blind and has connections to characters through the web of time, is what I call it, webs and stuff. She can see the future, she can see the past. She's a precog, if you will, and that's one of the main pieces of her power. And she can travel through that time to warn characters about impending danger, or she can move through the web of time to save people, things like that. This movie deals with that, but here we have a younger Cassandra Webb, who played by Dakota Johnson. She's an EMT, medical team person, and her abilities are awakened after a near-death experience, and she becomes inundated with images and things that she's not quite fully able to understand just yet. She can see the future. She knows she's going to be coming into contact with some girls at some point, and she is having to try to negotiate that and will eventually have to get them out of trouble. On the journey, she comes across Ezekiel, who is our villain, who has his own mysterious past and connection with the teenage girls, and he's trying to stop them from stopping him. And along the way, hijinks ensue, and that's that's what happens. That's sort of basically the plot. You have Cassandra trying to save three teenage girls from Ezekiel, who was trying to kill these girls. In a nutshell, that's the plot. I think the biggest problem with this movie had to do with the script. The writing was had some challenges, and if you look it up, you'll see there's probably like, I think, 3 or 4 various writers attached to this project, and it feels like the movie was Frankenstein together with ideas from each of these writers, and this is the script we got. There's not a lot of subtlety in the script. A lot of it feels fairly heavy-handed, and also just like some of the character motivations and how it's written, particularly when you consider the teenage girls. So a lot of that doesn't feel, a lot of how they interact, there are moments where you could see the potential and the dynamics between these characters, and how you could see where, oh, that's a good moment between them. But then the film is written in such a way that it does not allow room for the audience member to really sit with those characters, and it doesn't endear us to them when they make silly decisions. This is just like, you get more irritated when you start saying, why would you make that decision? Why would you make that decision? That's weird. Why would you, especially if you're a teenage young woman who's come into contact with an adult person who's somehow made their way into your life. I think the way the film portrays these teenagers, as there's like a little bit of apprehension, but then they're mostly trusting, which is weird. I feel like if you know anything about teenagers, if you've dealt with mostly, you might get a couple that are open to connect, but a lot of teenagers are not initially. It takes a minute to warm up. They have to warm up to you. And I don't know that this movie really does a good job of portraying that. And this is not the actor's fault at all. I just feel like how it was written, does a disservice to them. And I think the same is true for Dakota Johnson, who is great in this movie. She's actually fantastic. It's unfortunate that the script also doesn't do her any favors. And so that's the biggest problem. The second biggest issue, I think, has to do with the editing, which I think you can still trace back to the script because they're editing to the script. They have the foundation, and it's edited in a way that the movie spends time on the wrong things. The movie extends its time on the wrong things. So what, personally for me, as an audience member of this particular project, I would have liked more time spent with building the character dynamics between the teenage girls and Cassandra Webb. Like, there's not enough room to really care about them. And that's because the film is cut in a way where the interactions are too quick. And you just have just enough time to get the information that needs to be brought across for the audience to understand what's going on. And then you move on to the next thing. So a lot of it felt rushed. And you can see that in how it's cut. The action sequences too are not what you would have expected from a film like this. And I think part of that is not only the editing, but something in the visual effects. How the effects are rendered don't do the action any favors. And so it's cut in a way it feels like to hide some of the issues with the effects. I don't understand that. The budget was quite high, if I recall. It was like 180 million or something ridiculous. And it just leaves me wondering, where did the budget go? To the marketing? That wasn't great. To pay the actors, maybe. Okay, maybe that's what it was. Because you had some pretty good actors, and that's the one thing they did spend a decent amount of time on was the relationship between Cassandra and her partner Ben, who, if you're a Spider-Man fan, you know who Ben is. That was a great dynamic. That was really nice. But the further you get into the movie, everything else is like sped up. There's not enough time spent with Ben to really get like the richness of their relationship. I think you needed maybe a couple more scenes, and they do disservice to their relationship with the teenage girls too. That's which is unfortunate. Those are the strongest issues. The director, S.J. Clarkson, this is her first feature film. And it's unfortunate that this was the project that that was her first foray into films. I remember her work from Jessica Jones, the Netflix Jessica Jones show, which was a fantastic show. And she did some remarkable work on that show. I think a lot of that, it feels like, though, because it was streaming, there might have been a little bit more flexibility in terms of how she was allowed to tell that story. It was Netflix, but also Marvel had the other TV arm that I think now is not in existence anymore in the same way, like because everything has moved to Disney Plus. So I think there was a loss in control a little bit. I think when it comes to some of the properties, and I think that's what happened here because again, Sony is producing this movie, and it feels like a lot of the blame was unfairly placed on S.J. Clarkson. And at the end of the day, if to me it seems like she didn't get to tell the story she wanted to tell without, it feels like there was a lot of studio interference. If you look back at 2007's Spider-Man 3, this was an issue that came up with that movie where Sam Raimi had the movie he was making, but then executives at Sony were like, yo, you need to add Venom, you need to add all these extra things, which now, by all accounts, Spider-Man 3 is not a terrible movie, but it does lose some juice when compared to Spider-Man 1 and certainly Spider-Man 2, which is still the best of those three movies. If the studio was allowed Sam to make the movie he was actually trying to make for Spider-Man 3, I think you would have had a stronger result. And I think I feel like something similar happened with this movie. I don't think S.J. Clarkson was allowed to really make the movie she wanted to make. There are things in this movie, certain positions that the characters are put in that feel like if you're a woman director and you are running that set, it feels like you wouldn't have characters moving in certain ways that it just feels like, oh, these girls are stupid. Why are these girls doing this? And I think that's that's not her fault. That's a Sony thing that okayed it. They allowed that, but also that's again a writing thing. Like, that was written in a certain way, and I think to allow these teenage girls to let loose a little bit, there are other ways to do that. The way it's portrayed in this movie does not feel authentic to how teenage girls would act. Well, particularly these teenage girls who they come from somewhat broken backgrounds. Their family life is a little bit challenging, and so they would move a little bit differently. And so those are issues with how that's portrayed in the movie. Something I was thinking about during my viewing of this movie had to do with the portrayal of Madam Web. And I'm not talking about Dakota Johnson. I'm talking about the fact that they cast a younger actor to play a character that is more widely known as an elderly woman. Now, there's nothing wrong with, I understand in the comics, Madam Web they've recently, in recent years, created a younger Madam Web, which is fine. But I feel like there's a missed opportunity. I don't think they'll ever do this. It's unfortunate because a lot of the studios, the MCU even wouldn't do this. Why wouldn't they just tell the story from an elderly woman's perspective? Because it's not exciting enough. There's not enough action. Because she's old. You see this routinely with older male characters. You think of Clint Eastwood in Unforgiven, and you think of Liam Neeson. You can go down the list. There were older male actors out there doing action stuff. The interesting thing with Madam Web is because she can't physically move and she's blind. On paper, that maybe sounds boring. Like, how do you sell that? You had a unique opportunity with this character who fights differently than most other heroes. Most heroes use fire blasts. They have martial arts skills. They have weapons training. They do all these other things physically that Madam Web cannot do. And right there, that's a new pathway into exploring this character's abilities and how do you fight crime this way. This was one thing I think was positive that I actually liked about the movie, that you had a character who was fighting against a threat that was more physical, more elemental, if you will, that had an edge in that way. How do you beat something that can physically mess you up? Well, if you can control time in some way, and you can see the future, there's more mental gymnastics you have to do to beat a person like that. And that is the sort of gem of the power of Madame Web. They found ways to show how she can travel across, use the web that she can generate, the sort of special effects web. I'm trying to think of a good word to describe it. But part of her ability is to be able to travel across the different threads of the web that she's the center of. She can do a lot with that. And the movie, unfortunately, doesn't do enough with that ability against a threat like Ezekiel. Why couldn't you have told that story? You could still have almost everything happen the way it happens. And nothing against Dakota Johnson, because she's great. But I think if you were to properly cast Madame Web, this is I think Helen Mirren would have been a fantastic Madame Web. And you can still do stuff. It almost makes you have to think more creatively. Like it makes you have to, if you're making this movie, you have to think a little bit harder about how to tell a sort of superhero story that traditionally has a lot of explosions and a lot of action, all these crazy things that can still have it. This movie can still have it, but from the perspective of someone who cannot physically do a whole bunch of stuff that most superheroes can do. I think there's a better version of the movie in here. One person I neglected to mention was Tahar Rahim, who plays Ezekiel. He's the villain in this movie. And this is just another sort of nitpick that I had about the movie, is that why would you put this man in a semi-Spider-Man suit? To me, that calls too much attention to the character of Spider-Man, who is not in this movie and does not play any role in like for branding purposes. It feels more like a branding thing, which is unfortunate because you had already a decent look for him. He's this businessman with his beard, he's got a nice suit, and he's barefoot, right? That's a cool look. Why couldn't he move like that? I know why, but it feels like you guys could have told her, why are you evoking all this Spider-Man stuff? Because it just makes you want to watch Spider-Man. That's a better movie. And again, you don't want to be taken out of what's in front of you. I didn't anyway. I wanted to be immersed in what I was watching. So again, I mentioned how I was this big Spider-Man fan. There's this book. This is Coming Home, this graphic novel. Ezekiel makes his appearance in this book, and he has here. Let me show you something. Let me show you something real quick. This is a version of Ezekiel. Like the movie had him. He looks obviously different than this, but the bare feet, the suit, there's a look here that is cool enough for the story that they're telling. And I just was a little bit bothered that the suit that they used was like a Spider-Man suit. And it was completely unnecessary. There's nothing functional about it. It was just like, are you trying to hide your identity? Well, why? Like, why would you try? It feels like, I don't know. It just, that was weird. The other thing I will give the movie credit for with regard to the Spider-Man references is that they didn't go overboard with them. I'm sure there are tons of other Easter eggs in the movie that I caught several, but there's probably some other ones that are more subtle that I missed. But for certain Spider-Man reference pieces, the movie doesn't go overboard, and it takes you just close enough to the line that if you know Spider-Man, the character, and you know the sort of mythos, then you know what those references are. But if you don't, they're kind of just they're kind of like out in the air. Like, this is the other thing too. But if you're a new person who's coming into this story without any preconceived notion of other characters outside of Spider-Man, the movie could be pretty confusing because of some of those Spider-Man references too. They're small, but it would leave you questioning like, who's this person? Like, why is that line so important? Why, like, you know that you sense there's something important about it, but you don't really understand it because you don't know the Spider-Man backstory stuff. So things like that can get in the way, especially if they're not super important to the story at hand. They're just sort of like references just for the sake of having references in there. You could have made this movie with zero Spider-Man references and it would have been just fine. I'm okay with some of the references. Some of them are just kind of like, it's ridiculous. This movie was ripped to shreds when it came out. But having seen it now, I don't think the movie's as bad as it's made out to be. I think it will provide a lot of eye rolls. If depending on the kind of audience member you are, you may not some of the stuff may not even matter. But if it does matter and you pay attention to this kind of stuff, skip the Spider-Man stuff. Talking straight from like a story perspective, there's some story things that might annoy you. Just that aside, there are good things about it, and that's also probably what's more disappointing about the movies because the good things, you can sense there were good ideas with the character dynamics. You see little traces of them. You see traces of good threads, but it's not enough to save the picture, and that's what's most disappointing. It's like, man, you had things right there. You were so close to this moment. You could have had this, or you could have had this. The other thing, while I'm on that track, the one thing that was both good and disappointing was the Cassandra's relationship with her mom. The movie starts from the mother's perspective, and she's in Peru doing research, trying to find this elusive special spider that has these crazy properties. And that first third was rushed because I feel like the movie could have had more time with Cassandra's mom, because you want to buy into that relationship or the lack of the relationship between Cassandra and her mom. Because when you meet Cassandra, there's a gap between the two of them, and you don't really fully feel Cassandra's mom's absence because the first section of the movie when we meet Cassandra's mom is so short. If I compare it to the first Spider-Man movie, the reason a lot of that movie works because it was given proper time. Like, you look at the relationship between Peter and Uncle Ben, you know Uncle Ben's not going to make... If you know Spider-Man, you know he's not making it out of that situation. Ben does not get out of the movie unscathed. Uncle Ben is messed up. So the reason we care is because we spent the first third of the movie with Uncle Ben. You get to see him at the house with Aunt May. You understand the dynamics between Aunt May, Uncle Ben, and Peter. So when he ultimately meets his fate and Peter becomes Spider-Man, it hits harder. With this movie, I think you should have had more time devoted to Cassandra's mom. And because we're just thrown into like, oh, she's a smart researcher, she's pregnant and she's researching these spiders. We're immediately given that information in the first like 5 minutes of the movie. So we're supposed to immediately just be on board with what she's doing, and not really. It's not enough that she's pregnant in Peru and trying. She's out there doing research. Like, you're just like, why is she doing research when she's not? She should be, like, you don't really care a lot, and that's one of the big mistakes of the movie, because when you come across Cassandra and she's grappling with stuff with her mother, it feels hollow. And that's the kind of stuff that the movie does. There's a lot of things that feel hollow and not rich enough. But there is one moment in the movie where Cassandra and her mom do come together. And that's a great moment. But it's not... It could have been better with less dialogue. Like, less of the writing was like, you could just cut. It could have been stronger. That's probably one of the strongest movie aspects, character-wise, of the movie, next to the dynamic between Cassandra and her work partner. But yeah, ultimately, this movie isn't atrocious as I think it's been made out to be, but it does have problems. Just from my perspective, it has problems. But again, I wouldn't say don't waste your time, don't watch it. I would say, I think it just check it out if you're curious. Next up is Craven. If you know, Craven's got the other Spider-Man property. After the next Venom movie. So we know Venom's coming out, Venom 3, and Craven the Hunter is coming out. Both should be interesting movies. But if the track record of these Spider-Man villain movies is an indicator, you look at Morbius, and of course this movie, it doesn't bode well for Craven. But again, you've got a great lead in the role. Like hopefully it's at least as good as the first Venom movie. But we'll see. At any rate, I'm going to call it on this video. Thank you for taking the time to watch if you've stuck around this long. Come on back. I'll catch you in the next one. See you.